Good afternoon. My name is Luke Dykowski. Today is April 3rd, 2017. The time is 5 o'clock, and we are at St. John's Northwestern Military Academy. I'm interviewing Mr. Philip Baird, who was born on August 31st, 1921 in Peatone, Illinois, and served in World War II between 1942 and 1945. Mr. Baird was a machinist mate first class in the Navy and served as an aircraft technician. This interview is sponsored by the Bell Tower Memorial. Mr. Baird, thank you very much for being with us this afternoon. All right, so Mr. Baird, what were you doing before you entered the service?
I was in college at the time.
What were you studying in college?
Aircraft maintenance. I went to Parks Air College in Cahokia, Illinois, and received a bachelor's degree in aviation aircraft maintenance.
And so how did you develop your interest for aviation and aviation maintenance?
I started it back in high school. Well, long before that, actually. I used to make model airplanes. I carved model airplanes out of balsa wood. You know what balsa wood is?
Sure.
Carved it out of balsa wood, painted them and labeled them. Made some of them, made a couple from a regular wood, but most of the time it was with the balsa. It was easier working.
And so is this all the way when you were back in elementary school and middle school?
Yeah, I guess I started whittling out model airplanes, I guess, when I was in about 7th or 8th grade.
All right, so it was pretty cool. Oh,
I had airplanes on my mind from about age 5 on.
So it was pretty cool then that you were able to pursue that interest and actually go to college for it. So how long had you been in college when you entered, until you entered the service, or before?
When I entered the service, we went full 2 years. We had no time off during the 2-year period at Parks, and we had a couple of weeks off at Christmas and a couple of weeks at around Easter. That's all. But we had no vacation. But I graduated from Parks in 1941. Yeah, just before Pearl Harbor. In fact, it was September 41 I graduated from Parks Air College.
And so prior to that attack on Pearl Harbor, how did you view the events unfolding in Europe and in East Asia? Did you have any anticipation that the United States might be entering the war at some point?
No, really, I didn't at that time. I can truthfully say that I did not.
So then what was your reaction when you heard about the attack on Pearl Harbor?
Enlisted right away. But at the time, I went down and enlisted in the Navy Air Corps, and this was before Pearl Harbor, and they turned me down because I was I had color defective. They said you would not be able to land an aircraft at night on an aircraft carrier because of red and green lights. You could confuse them because of your color deficiency. So that put me down, put me on the ground for the rest of my life.
I could see how that might be a problem trying to land. So then they initially denied you because of the color deficiency.
Yeah.
So how did you end up then entering the service in 1942?
How did I end up 40? Well, trying to think, 42, where the heck was I at in 42? You're taking me back a long time, by.
Or maybe not specifically in 1942, I might have that date wrong. But when you rejoined the service to become, I'm sorry, not when you rejoined the service,
Oh,
but when they allowed you into the service to become a machinist.
Yeah, that was in 1940. Actually, I was still at Parks Air College as working there, and the Navy came out and recruited 75 of us.
Okay.
And we all went to New York then and entered the Navy Reserve and worked then on Navy aircraft. In fact, this thing here.
Okay, so can you tell us a little bit about that type of aircraft that you were working on?
Well, it's a flying boat. It's called a PB-4Y. It was originally built as a patrol bomber. That's why it's still called a PB-4Y. It was a patrol bomber, and they removed all of the armament from it and made a cargo carrier out of it. And that's how it wound up as a cargo aircraft. But it's still a PB-4Y is what the designated.
And what sort of cargo then were these flying boats carrying?
Anything that would fit in it.
If you don't mind, I'm going to show this
Yeah.
to the camera real quick.
Anything that would fit in there. We carried K rations, we carried machine parts, no animals. But you name it, we had it.
And where were these boats fly? Are these flying boats flying to?
Most of ours left LaGuardia, the Marine Terminal area in New York, and went to Africa via the Azores. You know where the Azores are at?
Yes.
That was a fuel stop. They couldn't make it all the way to Africa on the fuel. They had to stop at the Azores.
And how many of these flying boats were there?
We had 4. We operated 4 of them out of LaGuardia.
And were you exclusively working on the flying boats, or were there other sort of planes that you were responsible
We
for?
had passenger flying boats, but I've spent more of my time on the military.
And so when these flying boats then came back from North Africa, what sort of maintenance would they need?
Well, it depended on how many flight hours there were before they started the trip. Some of them would have to be put in the hangar and go through a heavy service. They'd run out of time. Some of them would be just tied up on the bay in a horseshoe type float, and it would be just like an overnight service and get it ready for the next day.
So in order to work on this sort of specialized machinery, what sort of training did you go through after you arrived in New York?
I went to 5 different service schools. Propeller service, two type of propellers, electric and hydraulic. Engine maintenance, Pratt & Whitney, Wright Cyclone, and then Hamilton Standard for the propeller, and GE for the electric propeller.
And how long did these courses take to complete?
They were usually ran anywhere from 1 to 3 weeks.
Oh, so it was a fairly rapid program
Oh,
that
yes,
they had
it
you
was,
put in.
yeah, you were in and out pretty fast.
So then how, in addition to learning how to maintain these planes, how did you adapt to military life once you entered the service?
It actually wasn't military life because we were a commercial airline, although
Okay.
we were given a Navy commission.
And
But-
which commercial airline was this that you were
Pan
with?
Am.
Okay.
And I was with Pan Am for 36 years. I retired in 1980 from Pan Am.
Now, were you working with Pan Am before you entered the service as well? Or before you went out to New York as well?
No, I was working in St. Louis at Parks Air College until they came out. There were 75 of us recruited to come to New York and maintain these things.
So if you don't mind, I'd actually like to talk a little bit about what you were doing at Parks Air College then.
At the time they came out for this, I had already graduated and I was working for Parks. We were overhauling their airplanes. Parks had a fleet of primary trainers, and we were in the process of overhauling as they come due, rebuild them.
Okay. All right. So you were at Parks Air College. The Navy came down and rounded up 75 guys, you said, to go out to New York, and that's where you were working on the flying boats, which
Yeah.
were then
Yeah,
flying
that's-
cargo
yeah.
into North Africa. All right, excellent.
They came out and recruited 75. There were 75 of us agreed to go to New York and work on these. They had 4 American Export. It was a steamship company, but they had an airline. They formed an airline during the war. Of course, it didn't last after the war. The government took it away from them. But during the war, American Export actually had. We had 4 of these under American Export, and eventually they became Pan Am. American Export. The government says you can't operate an airline and a steamboat. This was after the war. They said you couldn't, so everything went back to Pan Am then.
And so then after American Export became Pan Am,
Oh, yeah.
you continued to work with
I
Pan
stayed
Am
with
for
I
several
stayed with
decades.
Pan Am for 36 years.
All right. So then, while you were in New York, what do you consider your most important contributions to be to the war
Ooh.
effort, or to the process?
Oh. I guess my loyalty to the company would be probably the most, because there's an awful lot of them that left shortly after the war. They just didn't. They were there just to get out of going to the service, and I made that was my life ambition to stay with Pan Am until I retired.
It's a pretty impressive commitment to stay with them for 36 years.
Yeah.
Could you share with me an example of strong leadership that you encountered while you were working on the planes in New York?
You mean the leaders? I as the leader, or as?
Either way, either way.
Well, I had one supervisor that I tried to pattern myself after. I guess that would be the one thing. And then I had wound up with a crew and tried to manage it and work with him like he did when he was. And we had I had a pretty successful operation going with a crew of about 9 people.
And so what sort of traits that this gentleman exhibited, that your supervisor exhibited, were you trying to pattern yourself after?
What kind of what?
What kind of traits or leadership skills in particular did
Oh.
he have that you then tried to, or it sounds like you then successfully used when working with your crew?
Well, mainly I think is to try to manage the individuals, not, how do I want to put this? Not show difference between them, as one individual is the same as the other individual. Try to manage them the same way.
Oh, all right. Excuse me. So then, did you find yourself using that same attitude and that same approach to leadership later in your career after the war was over, when you were still working with Pan Am?
Oh yeah, I think that was one of the main reasons I stayed in the business, is the fact that I was able to get along with people, treat them all individual, not as an individual, but as a group.
And so, were you then, when you were working for Pan Am after the war,
Yeah.
were you in leadership positions as well with maintenance crews?
Yeah, I had a crew of 9 men, and we were assigned the outside maintenance. In other words, most of the work that we did, the airplanes were outside. We got them ready to take to the gate for after they came out of the hangar. Then my crew would get a hold of them and get them ready for, take them over to the gate for passengers.
All right. Now, if you don't mind, we're going to hop back to between 1942 and 1945 again. And so you said that you were not, while you had a rank in the Navy, you were not technically in the service.
That's right.
So
We were given the I guess when they came out to Parks and recruited the 75 people, that was one of the stipulations. They said that the first thing you're going to do is you're going to go to Navy headquarters, and you're going to become given a status in the Navy. And I'm trying to think why the Navy got involved. I think it was during the period when Pan Am had those the Navy flying boats, and they were treated. We had the captains were dressed as a Navy uniform. They weren't wearing a Pan Am uniform, and even though they were civilians, but they were dressed. They were dressed in the regular Navy uniform.
okay. So then, in New York, were you living in a military setting, or were you living in a more civilian setting?
Wife and I moved to New York in 1943. She was 7 months pregnant at the time. We found an apartment right next door to LaGuardia, actually. It was called Garden Bay Manor. It was, I could walk to work. I didn't have to try.
It's pretty convenient.
And we got an apartment there, and eventually we moved to like a townhouse in the same development, but out of the 3-story apartment.
So then, would you be able to describe to me some of the ways that you noticed that civilian life in the United States during the war had changed as a result of the war?
Well, I don't know exactly how to put it.
Was there maybe a different public mood that you could sense when you interacted with people on a daily
Well,
basis?
I'm trying to an incident that happened to me while I was walking down the street in Jackson Heights, and considered, they didn't know that I was Navy. They, because of my age at that time, that was 1942, I was a draft dodger to those people. They didn't know that I was a Navy, because I didn't wear a uniform. We didn't wear uniforms.
It's a rather
But,
unfortunate mix-up.
That upset me a little bit.
I can understand.
Yeah, because I'd been serving with the service for quite a while.
Absolutely, and doing some very important work if you're
Yeah,
flying all those
yeah.
supplies to
Well, you
North
see,
Africa.
at that time, 1942, I was, that's how many years ago? 50 some odd years ago?
Well, yeah,
So
quite a few.
I'm
70.
95, so that I was in my 30s, and they didn't think I should be walking around in the street, I guess. They figured I was a draft dodger.
Do you remember your reaction, or the pub? Do you remember your reaction specifically, or the general public's reaction to some of the major events during the war, like when you heard about the landings at Normandy, or or say victory at Midway or at Iwo Jima? Do you remember what you felt, or what the public felt, what the news headlines might have been?
Not really. I don't remember ever. I think we were at that point. I think we were more than happy that things were turning to our side rather than the other side. For a while, it didn't look like we were going to be at the. That's about the only thing I can remember about that.
Do you remember what your reaction was when you heard about the dropping of the atomic bombs?
Oh. My reaction when I heard about it. First, it sort of scared me to think that we had something that destructive. But after I got thinking about it, I realized that that put shortened the war by several months or years, and then it didn't bother me as much. But it did at first.
So if the war had continued, would you have continued to work in New York on the flying boats?
That's hard to tell. I really don't know what would have happened if we had continued on. We had a military contract, of course, and we were flying military equipment. I don't know. I have no idea what would have happened.
Excuse me. So then, after the atomic bombs were dropped, and after Japan surrendered, and then obviously earlier in the year Germany had surrendered, did you attend any of the VE or VJ Day celebrations?
The VE Day, I was in New York, and I went down to Times Square that day, the celebration. You almost get killed with the people down there because it was jammed. It was really jammed. But I didn't go to I went to the VJ, but I didn't go to VE, the European. I just didn't want to get involved in the crowd again.
Could you describe maybe the atmosphere, or even just how long you were there? What did that day look like when you went to those celebrations?
Mobs. people, that's all I can say. You could hardly move on Times Square. It was that crowded. You see pictures of it during some celebrations. Well, it was like that. You just couldn't move around. It was, you got shoved and pushed. And finally, I got out of there and went back to Jackson Heights where I belong.
It's probably, I would guess it was a pretty enthusiastic crowd as well.
Oh, it was. The wife says, "What the hell do you want to do? Go down there for and get mobbed." And that's actually what happened.
So did she not come with you?
Oh,
Eddie?
no, she
Okay.
wouldn't leave the.
So then, obviously, looking back at it, World War II was one of, if not the defining event of the 20th century. So as the war drew to a close, did you have a sense that the world had changed? Was there a sense that you were on the edge of something completely different from what you had seen prior to the war?
I can't really say I did. I don't really remember, but I don't think I had any idea that things had changed that much.
Do you remember then what you anticipated that the world might look like in the next couple decades?
No, I didn't look that far.
Excuse me. So then, after the war was over, you said that you went and you continued to work with Pan Am for the next 36 years.
Right.
And were you in New York this whole time?
No, I moved to Chicago. I opened up the Pan Am base and maintenance base in Chicago in 1954. I'd spent 10 years in New York. The remainder of my 36 years, 26 years, was at operating Pan Am in New York, Chicago.
So then the skills or lessons that you learned during your service in New York during the war, were you able to apply those later in your career?
I can't really say yes to it. I really don't. I don't know that I can be truthful and say yes. I could, but I can't.
With the exception of then you had mentioned earlier, kind of the individual, or I'm sorry, not the individual, but the group leadership style.
Well,
Is there a lesson then that you think the United States or the world as a whole should learn from the war?
oh. Well, we should have learned, that's for sure. Whether we did or not, I don't know. I think we did. We learned a lesson, but I'm not certain sometimes.
What lesson do you think that is?
Well, you put me on a spot now, because I really don't have a real good answer for that.
That's fair enough. It's probably not the kind of question that you were expecting.
Yeah.
That's okay.
Definitely not. It would take a little time to think about that.
All right, excuse me. So, I was going to ask you then, I apologize, I'm completely and totally hitting a blank. So could you describe what kind of work you were doing at these maintenance bases for Pan Am that you opened up in Chicago? Was it kind of the same line of work that you were doing for Pan Am in New York?
Basically, yes, except that I had bosses in New York where I had no boss out there. My boss was in New York and I was in Chicago. So I had to, it was up to me to make sure that things went like it was supposed to. Otherwise, I'd have been on the carpet with New York.
Did you enjoy that degree of autonomy?
Oh yeah, I enjoyed being able to do things my way and not having somebody tell me that you can't do it that way.
And so were you working solo, or were you in charge of a 9-man crew or a similar size
I
crew?
wound up with a crew of about 7 or 8 men, but I started out with only 2.
Okay. All right.
But as we grew, we had a daily service. We started a daily service from Midway to London, and I had one other man for about a couple of months, and then I hired another. So I wound up with 2 mechanics and myself operating. Then when when Pan Am moved to O'Hare, at that time it was called, what was it called? Well, anyway, O'Hare. Then I wound up with a crew of 9 people because we had a full operation then.
All right. I believe that is just about it. So I'm going to swing my chair back over. All right. Oh, I'm sorry. In closing, this has been an interview of Philip Baird regarding his service during World War II. My name is Luke Dykowski. The time is 5:31. Mr. Baird, thank you very much for agreeing to this interview, and more importantly, thank you very much for your service.
Well, thank you for having me. I've enjoyed it.